Very few questions are more important than the one we ask in this video title. Where will the Antichrist come from? I'm sure some ideas flashed into your mind immediately. Many are probably thinking the USA, or some maybe even Israel. Some will think Rome, or maybe out of the European Union. Others will say Russia. There are so many theories, so many powerful, selfish men to choose from. But how many of you guessed the location given in Daniel chapter 8 and the prophecy of the ram and the goat? Anybody? Did anybody choose that one? Or am I the only one? It's not a prominent prophecy, so many of you are probably not familiar with it. The rest are probably thinking, Nelson, I hate to tell you, dude, but that prophecy was fulfilled by Alexander the Great. So you're off by only 2,300 years or so. You're close, but not quite there on this one. And frankly, I used to think that way myself just 7 or 8 years ago. Then I ran into these verses from Daniel 8. In the middle of the chapter, the angel Gabriel, who is giving Daniel this vision of the future, tells him 3 times this vision pertains to the time of the end or the end times. Not just one time when he said, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. Not just twice when he said, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation. But he said it a 3rd time. It pertains to the appointed time of the end. That caught my attention. And hopefully it has caught yours as well. Maybe that's why Gabriel said it 3 times. He knew he really had to make his point for us to get it. This realization that Daniel 8 might have future implications as well as past implications changed my way of thinking about prophecy. I realized that a single prophecy might have a first partial fulfillment in the past, close to the time when it was given, like that of Alexander the Great, and then a second final fulfillment in the future. And since this prophecy mentions the little horn, the Antichrist, and where he comes from, maybe we should pay attention to it. But first, let's look at a famous example of a prophecy with 2 fulfillments. In Isaiah 7:14, the prophet was given a prophecy that a virgin would conceive a child who would be God with us. Matthew 1:23, the gospel writer tells us that the final fulfillment was Jesus. However, did you know that the Old Testament sign was one given to King Ahaz? In those days, a young woman, not a virgin, would give birth to a son, name him Emmanuel, and that before the child was weaned, Ahaz would defeat his enemies? So this prophecy was deemed fulfilled. That is, until the birth of Jesus made the early believers realize that it was to have a second, greater fulfillment. And Daniel 8 is exactly the same. Because the events that took place between Persia and Greece 2,300 years ago seemed like they fulfilled the prophecy, everyone has assumed it was a one-and-done prophecy, even me. But 10 years ago, a prophecy teacher named Mark Davidson noticed this passage we alluded to earlier. There is no escaping the truth of God's word. The vision pertains to the time of the end as well. Now, when we looked at the prophecy about the virgin birth, we saw that Isaiah 7:14's Old Testament fulfillment was just a shadow of what was to come when Jesus was born. Let's look at Alexander the Great and see if he fulfilled this prophecy perfectly or only partially. The prophecy tells us that the prominent horn, who most think is Alexander, will be the first king of his empire. However, we know from history that Alexander's title was Alexander III of Macedon. He wasn't the first king. He wasn't even the first Alexander. In fact, although history is not exactly clear, he was about the 23rd king of Macedon. Already, we have a problem. The prophecy goes on to tell us that the first king will die and his empire will be split into 4 sub-kingdoms. At first, this seems like a match with Alexander. Alexander did die suddenly and his empire was divided by his generals. Historically, this is known as the Wars of the Diadochi. Initially, there were 24 of them. Then, as warfare took its toll, the number decreased. Eventually, it consolidated to 5, and then to 2 main portions, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, with a separate leader in Greece. But here's the important point. There was never a time when there were 4 distinct sub-kingdoms, as Scripture says, and it was certainly never initially divided into 4. This is another incredible problem for the historic fulfillment of this prophecy. The prophecy then moves on to someone it calls the little horn. Those who ascribe to a historic interpretation assume this means a man named Antiochus Epiphanes, a king of the Seleucid Empire who persecuted the Jews and desecrated the temple. He is the Bible's best foreshadow of the coming Antichrist. However, there are several things in the text that just can't apply to him. The text says he caused some of the host and some of the stars of heaven, meaning angels, to fall to the earth. No one believes he did this. The very next verse says he magnified himself to be equal with Jesus. First, he never did this, and second, Jesus wasn't born for another 160 years. Later in the passage, it says he will destroy mighty men and the holy people. Now, he did persecute the Jews, but he was rather ineffective as a military commander. He never conquered the Egyptians, who he repeatedly attacked, and even backed down and turned away when confronted by the Romans. Finally, the prophecy says he will be broken without human agency. But that isn't true either. He was defeated by the Maccabees. Our celebration of Hanukkah remembers the rededication of the temple after this victory. Finally, the prophecy also tells us the little horn will arise when the rule of the 4 nations reaches its end. However, historically, this is also not a match. Antiochus reigned around 160 BC, but the Diadochi continued their reign for another 100 years, until finally the Romans acquired the territory. So as we've just seen, there are at least 7 inconsistencies with a historic fulfillment. When we add the 3 statements by the angel Gabriel that the prophecy is for the end times, I think we all need to seriously lay aside our previous notions that this was a one-and-done prophecy. It's not just in the past, there is a coming future fulfillment. So we need to examine how it might be fulfilled. This isn't a prophecy we should just pass over and ignore because we think it was fulfilled long ago. It might be something that will happen next week or even next year. Every Christian needs to know this prophecy and consider its implications, especially the implications of where the Antichrist or little horn will come from. So, let's get started. The prophecy in Daniel 8 begins with a ram with 2 horns. We are told later in the prophecy that this ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. This, of course, is another thing that throws everyone off and makes them believe it is only a historic prophecy. Persia was an ancient country, right? Well, it was. Today, the country of Iran occupies that same piece of land. However, imagine how confused Daniel would have been if Gabriel had told him the ram was the kings of Iran. He'd say, where is that? That is why, in all ancient prophecies, the names used for the countries are the ancient names for these land masses. Media and Persia is the land mass for Iran, or possibly Iran plus the Kurds. That is the ram in its modern fulfillment. Now, what are rams known for? Headbutting, right? Well, that is exactly what the text tells us will happen. The text tells us the nation of Iran will expand, butting its way north, westward, and southward. Let's look at a map and see where that might be. Butting their way westward would place Iranian influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza. And guess what? Iran already has controlling interest in 3 of these 4 areas, and it's a major player in the 4th, Syria. Has this aspect of the prophecy already been fulfilled? Well, maybe. Butting their way south, Iran already has significant influence in Yemen. Now, they haven't expanded north yet. Are Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Georgia on their hit list? Well, perhaps. So it is entirely likely that this prophecy has begun, but maybe it's not complete yet. So let's continue to examine the rest of the prophecy. The next aspect of the prophecy is that no one will be able to stand before this Persian ram, and no one will rescue the region from his power, and to date, no one has. Finally, the prophecy says Iran will do as it pleases and will magnify itself. What do these verses mean? There are several ideas. My friend Mark Davidson, who we mentioned earlier, believes Iran will attack north into eastern Turkey and south into Saudi Arabia and control most of Middle East oil supplies, disrupting the entire world economy. His is a doomsday scenario, and he might be correct. Of course, he might be wrong. Headbutting, to me, implies butting into the affairs of another nation, not necessarily invading it. So another less ominous possibility is that with the help of their ally Russia, Iran continues their head-butting strategy and takes over Iraq and Syria and maybe Armenia and Azerbaijan. Let's see what this might look like. If Iran eventually controls Syria, they'd control this border. They already control Iraq, so they control this border. They obviously control their own border, and if they control Armenia, they would control this border. Look at what country is totally boxed in. Turkey. Now let's keep that in mind. The final aspect of the Iranian phase of the prophecy is that we are told the ram magnifies itself. Some translations say it becomes great. What might that mean? Iranian Shia Muslims are 12ers. That means they are awaiting their Messiah, the 12th Imam, who supposedly is in hiding. Iranian leaders say they already know who he is. Might he be revealed during this period of Iranian expansion? Well, maybe. It is something we should be watching for. But then, according to the prophecy, the tables turn. Daniel saw a goat coming from the west with a single, big, prominent horn. He was coming at the ram. Later in the prophecy, this goat is identified as the nation of Yavan. Our English Bibles mistranslate this as Greece, but Yavan is correct. So where is Yavan? Yavan is one of the original 70 nations in the book of Genesis. It's thought to include the coastal region of western Turkey and eastern Greece, and also the Bosphorus Straits. The most prominent city in this region is Istanbul, the former capital of the Ottoman Empire. Let's keep that in mind. This goat, then, might mean Western Turkey or even a revived Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans' capital was Istanbul, so that makes sense. We're told the goat attacks the ram and hurls him to the ground. The interesting word in this passage is enraged. Turkey, or more likely, the revived Ottoman Empire, is enraged with Iran. Why is that? Well, for one, we just saw that if Iran expands as prophesied, it will box in Turkey. But the anger will probably go much deeper than political differences. The religious divide between Iran and Turkey goes back many years to the first years after the death of Muhammad. Sunni Muslims are found in Turkey and Saudi Arabia and make up about 85% of Islam, and Shia make up the remaining 15% and are based out of Iran. They are struggling for how the true Islam will be defined. So can you imagine the hostility in Turkey if Iran declares their Messiah has come, the 12th Imam? Turkey wants their own Sunni Messiah to save the world, not a Shia Messiah. The attack on Iran will likely carry great religious weight. And according to the prophecy, we know that Yavan wins and Iran is crushed, just as the foreshadow of Alexander the Great crushed Persia. It is at this point the revived Ottoman Empire, Yevan, magnifies itself, just as Iran did earlier. But the Bible adds a word here. It magnifies itself exceedingly. Does the revived Ottoman Empire based out of Istanbul declare itself to be a caliphate, a worldwide Islamic government? I think that is the most likely possibility. And this will scare the world to death. 1.3 billion Muslims united under one ruler is scary. How does the world respond? We don't know, but the word tells us that the leader of Yevan, its first king, is broken, probably killed, and the empire is broken up into 4 sub-kingdoms. To me, this sounds like the world superpowers do a job on the caliphate to take it down before it can get organized, just like Germany was broken into pieces after World War II. We see in the pages of prophecy that this caliphate will be broken into 4 segments, aligned with the 4 winds, north, south, east, and west. And now we come to the main point of the video, the part you've been waiting for about the Antichrist. And this part is also the real reason that I personally think most scholars refuse to accept Daniel 8 as future, because it identifies the part of the world where the Antichrist arises. And they don't like what it says. It tells us the little horn, the Antichrist, arises out of one of the 4 divisions of this caliphate. And we know which of the 4. We're told the Antichrist power increases to the south, to the east, and to the west. The beautiful land is Israel, and it's in the west. So what is left? The north, the king of the north. The Antichrist comes out of the northern partition of the caliphate, Turkey, northern Syria, or northern Iraq. No matter what you think about Obama or Trump or the next American president, the Antichrist isn't American. No matter what you think about the Pope or the EU, the Antichrist isn't from a revived Roman Empire. Daniel 8 tells us he is Middle Eastern. Contemplate that for a while. Let's see what else Daniel says about him. He is a little horn. He is smaller than the other horns around him, initially less powerful. He is not a leader right now. Not the Pope, not a president, and notice he doesn't arise until after the revived Ottoman Empire or Caliphate is divided. No major leader on the scene today is the Antichrist. He comes on the scene after Iran is defeated and after the Caliphate is divided. It's pointless to speculate who he is right now. Absolutely pointless. Oh, but isn't it fun to speculate? And that drives 50% of discussions on prophecy websites, and it sells a lot of books. But it's dangerous, because if we're looking in the wrong places, like America or Europe, we will miss the true Antichrist. Knowing what will happen in the near future is important. Knowing how to apply that knowledge for kingdom purposes is priceless. We need to be doers of the word, not just hearers. The first critical application of this prophecy is in something I term apocalyptic evangelism. That means seeing something in the world that was prophesied and testifying that the event is found in the Bible. The Great War between Turkey and Iran will be one of those events. Every Christian should be alert and watching for that sign. No matter what your rapture position is, this could happen before any pre-trib rapture or pre-wrath rapture or post-trib rapture. When we see it happen and Iran is crushed, Christians need to share Daniel 8 with every person they know for 2 reasons. 1, it will be one of the strongest apologetic arguments of all time, an undeniable prophecy fulfilled before the eyes of the world. 2, everyone you share with needs to know what the prophecy says will happen from that point on. It's key that everyone we share with know that the revised Ottoman Empire that forms and crushes Iran isn't the Beast Empire, and its leader won't be the Antichrist. It will be so tempting to think that they are. I personally think this is part of the deception that Jesus warned us is coming. There will be many false messiahs, and it is likely this leader of the caliphate that is coming will try to become some sort of religious leader as well. He'll look just like the little horn. But he plays another role. He's the prominent horn of the goat, an Alexander the Great type of character. But he's going to be broken, and the caliphate is going to be split into 4. He's the prominent horn, not the little horn. And don't we all want to think the Antichrist will be that prominent horn? All of us want to imagine him as a current leader, not someone initially insignificant. And, of course, we need to keep our eyes on someone coming out of this region. This is where the Antichrist will come from, according to Daniel 8, and most likely from this bullseye part of the region. Until next time, this is Nelson Walters for the Gospel in the End Times.